And welcome. Welcome to Benchley Night, ladies and gentlemen. It is New Year's Eve. How are you all out there in internet land? Oh, I realize I'm like a minute late. My apologies for that. I was making sure that a certain cat was inside, which he is. New Year's Eve. It's interesting, thinking about how New Year's Eves have changed over my lifetime, how my celebration of them has altered. As a child, this was a night that my mother proudly would always say was when she was going to go to bed by 9:30. And that meant that it was the one night of the year that my siblings and my father and I were allowed to watch television as late as we wanted. That meant we got to watch things like Gunsmoke, which the title of which was far more interesting than the actual show. I don't remember a thing about Gunsmoke, except that it was not nearly as good as the title. Hi, Terry Hudson. Hi, Facebook user. Over Saxon's River, Ms. Martha Rowley. Ms. Martha Rowley, ladies and gentlemen, a indefatigable and much appreciated supporter of the liberal snowplowing do-gooders. But anyway, back to celebrations of New Year's Eve. Then I really don't recollect anything terribly interesting about New Year's Eves until our good friend Gary Smith, who lived over in Walpole, came to town or came to the area. Gary Smith, ladies and gentlemen, was a highly successful music manager. He produced the Pixies, he produced Billy Bragg, he ran a recording studio called Fort Apache. I don't think he was quite as good a businessman as he thought he was, but that's not really the topic for tonight. This is a pure appreciation of Gary Smith. Gary Smith, who left us this last year, he went to the great New Year's party in the sky. But in my adulthood, I really remember a bunch of Gary Smith's New Year's Eve parties, because Gary Smith loved hosting things. He kind of lived for it. And I don't know if anybody watching tonight went to any of those Gary Smith New Year's Eve parties, but I just jotted down 4 that I recollect. Oh, the first one was, I think it was like 2004, 2005. It was when we still had a little bit of winter, but he wanted to have a party that took place down at his pond, and he built a huge wood pile on the ice on his pond, a huge bonfire, right? And he lit it, and the ice wasn't quite thick enough, and so there was a great deal of wondering if it was actually going to fall into the pond. And if memory serves, I believe it did. So that was, and then I remember tripping a lot, falling down a lot, trying to get back up to the house. It was just when my leg was starting to go bad. And I think I had probably not realized that I should need to curb somewhat my alcohol intake if I was going to be walking through the snow back up to the house. The next year, I believe it was, or maybe the year after that, was a very icy New Year's Eve. And Gary Smith was concerned about all of his guests hurting themselves because it was hazardous out there. And I said to Gary that it was triage time, that if he wanted to make sure that his guests were not going to hurt themselves on the ice, he had to spread wood ashes. He spread a lot of wood ashes, ladies and gentlemen. I think he could have spread about 1/3 the amount of wood ashes that he did, but he made sure that none of his friends would get hurt coming into the house. And the next morning, the amount of wood ash tracked all over his very, very beautiful house was astonishing. It was something, ladies and gentlemen. He was kind of mad at me, I think. But no one hurt themselves. No one slipped. No one died. Then a year or two after that, friends of his, dear, dear friends of his, their in-laws came to the New Year's Eve party, a husband and wife, a young husband and wife. And they got into a horrible fight. Smith had a huge communal dining table. They got into a fight at that dining table, and they carried that fight. It was like Walpurgis Nacht. It was like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, except with 20-somethings. It was astonishing, ladies and gentlemen. And they lost their dog in the middle of the fight. They thought the dog had followed one of the guests home. And so there were like 3 hours of them driving down various roads and coming back and fighting more and going and looking for the dog and calling for the dog and people going off on skis looking for the dog. And at like 3 in the morning, it was discovered that the dog had quite wisely just gone upstairs and gone to sleep. That was a memorable, memorable New Year's Eve. And then there was the New Year's Eve where Gary had many of his musician friends. This is fairly late in the Smith New Year's Eve parties of yore, because I made the very wise decision to go to sleep at about 12:30 rather than staying up all night with Gary and his little friends, because Gary loved excess, which is part of why we loved him, but it was hazardous to do the full Gary. But I went, and he had many, many guests that night, and so I was put in. He had made the house into, it was kind of a shaker house, but he had put a recording studio in one corner of it. And I was sleeping in the recording studio room. And I don't know what happened. I don't know how the wiring was done. But at some point at night, I had gone to sleep, as I say, at a very reasonable hour, like 12:20 p.m. or 12:20 a.m. I had gone to sleep. And at 3:30 in the morning, I was bolted out of bed with an extraordinarily loud version of a cover. It was a cover version of Bob Dylan's song Isis. Just because there was a guy who had just recorded that and wanted to play it for his friends at 3:30 in the morning. But I don't know what they did to the speaker wiring. But I was in dreamland and feeling pleased with myself that I was not going to be terribly hungover the next day. And all of a sudden, it's like, I married Isis in the 6th day of May. That wakes you up. That wakes you up, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, let us raise a glass. I have my coffee by morning, Benchley by night mug with the Liberal Snowplowing Do-Gooder Fund logo on the front. Let us raise a glass to Mr. Smith, a good man, gone too soon. All right. Now, we are going to have, because it's New Year's Eve, and I figure anybody who is here has nothing better to do, we're going to have 3 little three little Robert Benchleys. These are all from my 10 years in a quandary and how they grew. An excellent collection of Benchley works. First off, oh, wait. We've got some people to thank. Now, our beneficiary tonight, of course, was the Windham County Humane Society, where my late cat Silas donated so much money. The Windham County Humane Society, a bunch of people contributed tonight. We have to thank Ms. Terry Hudson. Oh, Catherine Fisher's dogs. Her dogs contributed, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. John T. Wilhelm out there in Omaha, Nebraska. Mr. Jubal Lee Young down there in Nashville, Tennessee. Mr. Jubal Lee Young, son of the great songwriter, Mr. Steve Young. Thank you, Mr. Jubal Lee Young. His office is in Bellows Falls, but I think he moved to Westminster. The wuss. Mr. Bill Stevens. Mr. Gary Pierce and Aline Cortez down there in Western Massachusetts, invaded by bears, but always keeping the faith. Out there in Taos, New Mexico, with her dog Fergus, who chews all his chew toys to death in the first 2 or 3 hours, and her elderly cat Tess, who keeps order over the whole thing. Ms. Meg Miser. Over there in Saxons River, Vermont, over there where she keeps watch over the crazy neighbors with trampolines and hot rods, but she's a wonderful supporter of what we do, and a dedicated library trustee, Ms. Martha Rowley. And out there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they no longer have the steel mills, but they still have the Steelers. They no longer have the beating heart of America, but they got the Pirates. My very, 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 very tall cousin, Mr. Nat Hunter, his wonderful wife Elise, and their wee little dog Ginger. So I figure if we're here tonight, none of us have a hell of a lot to be doing. So I'm going to do 3 little short Robert Benchleys from my 10 years in a quandary and how they grew. Now let's see. Let's just say hi to some folks here. We've got Judith out there in Michigan. Facebook user Martha says, Steve's son. Yes, indeed. And Amy Erickson, my friend Amy Erickson, a wonderful, wonderful painter out in Portland, Oregon. She says hello and cheers. Helen says, I don't know what Helen says. Helen says some symbol. Tony Hewlett says hi from Wisconsin. Lily Lauren says hello and Happy New Year. Lori LaRue says hello. And it is wonderful that everybody is here. Okay. Up first, Sluggards, Ahoy. At a recent so-called hobby exhibit in New York, a young man entered as his hobby a colony of ants. I remember thinking at the time, well, sir, presumably the young man who was specializing in zoology took up ants as a hobby because he subscribed to the age-old theory that man has a great deal to learn from the ants. As a matter of fact, the only thing I ever learned from an ant was not to try to carry too big a crumb on my back, or else I would walk sideways. And now, along comes as smart an ant watcher as Professor Julian Huxley, who says that we humans can not only hold our own with ants, but possibly might be able to slip over a couple of tricks on them every once in a while. One of the important differences between a human being and a termite is the matter of size, says Professor Huxley, cracking down with a dictum. Important difference. Professor, an important difference? That's a colossal difference. It's the difference between my sleeping in my bed or an ant's sleeping there. That's all. If we had ants as big as fox terriers and wasps as big as eagles, continues Dr. Huxley. But there, I left it. I don't want to know. I don't want to know what the end of that sentence was. And I don't want anyone ever to begin a sentence that way again either, at least not within my hearing. The comforting thing about Professor Huxley's lecture was the statement that we really don't have to learn anything from the ant. We can go our way, and the ant can go their way. Contrary to our teachings, we do not have to be bending over all the time, studying exactly how the ants do it. Human beings and ants have a great many things in common, however. They are the only organisms which have rubbish heaps, slaves, and domestic animals, and which make war with military precision. Which brings me to a remark of Mrs. Patrick Campbell's, as what does not. Mrs. Campbell was sitting at dinner next to an ant watcher who was telling at considerable length about the remarkable organization of ant communities. They have teams and working units with subdivisions of labor, he said. An ant community even has an army. But no navy, I suppose, said Mrs. Campbell. And that just about fixes the ants. You, Mr. Grown-Up, one of the 8 things which is supposed to be wrong with the present generation of adults, not including the mere fact of being in the present generation of adults, which is no small handicap in and of itself, is that we did not learn enough about the science of physics when we were young. Well, might as well be that as anything. All of this is being remedied in the coming generation, thanks to the model laboratories, where children are being taught to do little tricks which involve the principle of light refraction and the coefficient of linear expansion. The best of it is that they don't know that they're being taught anything. They just think they're playing with eggs and playing with matches. Here is a list of problems which any kiddie in the modern laboratory can do. It is printed in the paper under the heading, Mr. Grown-Up, can you do these things? Well, first, Mr. Grown-Up is not my name, and I can do these things in a second. I may mess things up a little, but I'll get them done somehow. No child of 6 is going to get ahead of me. 1, can you place a shelled, hard-boiled egg in the mouth of a milk bottle and, without touching it, cause it to plop, into the bottle? Sure I can. Sure I can. I have not figured out how to do it yet, but I will do it. So I will do it if I have to use a robin's egg. Ha ha! You hadn't thought of that, had you, Mr. 6-year-old? 2. Tell why a stick placed in water at an angle appears to be bent at the surface. Well, what makes you think it does? That's telling them. 3. Produce a series. Three. Produce a. 3. Produce a series of sounds like chimes with a piece of string and a teaspoon. Hit the teaspoon repeatedly with a piece of string until it does give off a series of sounds like chimes. This is just a matter of perseverance. It may take quite a while, but before long you will kid yourself into thinking you hear chimes, whether you do or not. What's so great about chimes anyway? 4. Make innumerable images of one object with 2 mirrors. That's easy. 5. Tell why a balloon only partly inflated will apparently fill up when held tightly over the top of a milk bottle filled with steam. Because it does fill up. You didn't expect me to fall backwards at that one, did you? 6. Make a lighted candle seem to be burning inside a glass of water. Place the candle inside the glass of water and light it. Well, that cleans up Mr. Grown-Up's part of the examination. Now, we will ask Mr. 6-year-old some questions. That's 2, ladies and gentlemen. Shall we have one more? Let's have one more. Why not? We will have Penguin Feud. Oh, there is bad news from the Toledo, Ohio Zoo. Admiral and Jake, the 2 penguin buddies, have had a falling out. They do not speak. Admiral and Jake were recently acquired from the southern polar regions, where they were popular favorites. And according to South Polar gossip, they were inseparable. They even insisted that they be booked together at the Toledo Zoo for, as Admiral said when approached for the engagement, Jake and I are just like that. On arriving in Toledo, they were put in the same pen at their request. And when Admiral went into the pool for his morning, noon, afternoon, and evening dip, Jake would go too. Sometimes it was Jake who went first, with Admiral following. We must not give you the idea that Jake was just the weakling of the combination. The 2 were equally close friends. I am taking this all on the word. I am taking this all on the word of the zoo authorities, but it's also said that Admiral and Jake took strolls together around the pen, and they discussed the latest news from the South Polar regions in a temperate, though definitely intimate manner. So far as the police can learn, there was never a sign of personal animosity, never a harsh word, never an ugly look. There was even some idea of changing their names to Damon and Pythias. Then, Like a bolt from the blue, something happened. Whether it was something that Admiral said or something that Jake did not say, no one will ever know. The fact remains, the other day, they definitely severed relations. No brawling, you understand, just an agreement to disagree. Admiral now takes his plunge alone, and Jake waits until he is through. Jake totters back and forth on his constitutional, and Admiral watches from his club window until Jake is finished, and then whips out for a brisk walk alone. If they happen to meet, they look the other way. Jake bows slightly. I took the liberty of interviewing them for my paper, but I must confess I could get nothing from either one. Both being Harvard men, they preferred to let the matter go without publicity. After all, what concern of it is it of the outside world? I quote Jake first. There really is nothing in the story at all. Admiral and I are still great friends. It is true we do not see each other as much as we did, but what of that? I am sure that I speak for Admiral as well as for myself when I say that, should the occasion arise for a joint effort in behalf of some common cause, I would gladly cooperate to the extent of tending my name with his. Admiral, on the other hand, was perhaps more personal. Jake is, or was, too good a friend of mine for me to imply that the reason for our split up was due to his insufferable curiosity. What are you doing tonight? Who was that you were talking to? Where'd you get that fish? I simply couldn't stand it, that's all. But please don't print anything that would hurt Jake. I am sure that things will be straightened out and that we shall be back together again before long. I mean too much to Jake for him to let me go. When shown the above statement of Admiral's, Jake merely said, "Oh, that's what he thinks. That's what he thinks." In the meantime, the officials of the Toledo Zoo are in a quandary. Should they put Admiral and Jake in two separate pens, or just let them work things out for themselves? Sometimes these things can go on for months, and after all, Admiral and Jake, they were hired as a team. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is our final Robert Benchley for 2023. Thank you all so much for being faithful watchers of this admittedly obscure pastime of reading century-old American humorists. May 2024 bring us all great joy. May we see the end of the Trump dynasty for once and for all. May the craven Republicans go down in flames, and may you have a great, great year. You take good care. We'll see you next week, where it's about time to start reading My Life in Hard Times, the annual first part of the year reading of James Thurber's utter classic. Bye-bye.